When in closing, I first came up travelling the trains up here 15 years ago, and Auckland was faced with a train service that looked about it needed to be closed down, had 2 million people, and nobody used it. The stations were knackered and the trains were ancient. And as a city, I think Auckland's made a tremendous investment into something that now looks like a modern public transport system, and but that comes at a cost.
Great, thank you. You ring talk back and tell them that. Thank you. Thank you, because I know Wellington doesn't necessarily look like that at all. Right, moving on, councillors, to item number 9, and I welcome Alistair and Wayne and members of the Amenities Board that I see in the audience.
Good morning, Madam Chair, councillors. The report before you presents staff recommendations on the review that we've undertaken of the AREFA funding model. That's right. Just as a bit of a refresher, thinking back to the terms of reference of this review, the terms of reference were premised on the fact that Council would continue to fund a group of regional amenities, and the review was really focused on looking at the best way to fund those organisations and to keep them financially viable. We were not looking at the review at who should be one of those amenities, so that wasn't one of the issues that we were looking at. So the overarching objective of the review was to look at the best way to achieve long-term sustainable, affordable and predictable funding for the amenities, while recognising Auckland Council's purpose and its other responsibilities under its statutory framework. So just very quickly, I've already mentioned the terms of reference. We got them signed off back in February. We went away and we identified some issues with the current funding arrangement under the AREFA Act. We developed some criteria for evaluating any solutions to those issues that we identified. We came up with 7 different options for funding models, including what we currently have, the status quo, and the report before you looks at the evaluation of all those different options using the criteria that were previously agreed by this committee. Just as a very quick refresher, up there on the big screen are the 7 different options that we considered, number 1 being the status quo. The next 3 options were, if you like, amendments within the current legislative framework. Options 5 and 6 would require amendment to the current legislation, and option 7 was complete repeal of the current Act. I'd just like to point out that when we were undertaking our evaluation of the different options, we got extensive feedback from representatives of the regional amenities. We also engaged with the funding board. We went to the local boards and asked them for their feedback on any potential impacts at a local level on the different funding models that we were evaluating. Those were the big ones, but we also went and talked to people like Foundation North and other sort of interested parties in the funding sector. I'll just put up on the big screen, I don't expect you to look at this in any detail, but when we undertook our evaluation of the different options, we basically used the current funding model as the baseline, and then we looked at each of the different options using the different criteria that were agreed to see would the proposed option be better or worse than what we currently have. Just to give you an idea, green is good, red is bad, and sort of yellowy orange is fairly neutral. So just that slide is just to indicate that our preferred option was option number 3 up there, the sustainable funding option. The current Act is all about delivering financial sustainability for the regional amenities. But as we got further and further into the review, there were three, I guess, persistent issues that kept coming up time and again. First of those was that the current Act specifically prevents the provision of capital funding to the regional amenities. However, some of the regional amenities have quite extensive capital funding requirements, so that has caused issues in the past, and one of the things we look to address. Perhaps even more significantly, the Act requires the Funding Board to provide adequate, sustainable and secure funding to the amenities. Now, what is adequate funding for each amenity is determined through an annual funding process, which largely focuses on the needs of the amenities in the following financial year. It doesn't prevent consideration of longer term plans, but it certainly limits, I think, the consideration of where the amenities are wanting to go and what financial sustainability looks like for them in the medium term. And I think the third issue that came up, particularly from a council perspective, is that whilst Auckland Council is compelled to provide funding to the amenities, the opportunity for Auckland Council to ensure funding is directed towards, Council's highest priority strategic outcomes and goals is relatively weak within the regime. So the option that we're recommending that we pursue looks to develop the concept of sustainable funding for each of the amenities. That would require the Funding Board to establish a framework to define what financial sustainability is for each of the amenities, and for the amenities to develop medium-term plans that will assist in the decision making. It would also start looking more at issues around what's an appropriate level of reserves for each of the amenities to hold. Are we looking for them to break even? Is it okay for an amenity to maintain a level of reserves in their bank accounts, looking at their future needs, possibly even capital projects? And we also think the option provides better support or better supports the strategic alignment of what the amenities are doing and what Auckland Council sees as the needs within the region in terms of the Auckland Plan. So what we're recommending is, as a path forward here, is that the Funding Board would lead a process, put in place effectively a framework which would define what financial sustainability looks like for each of the amenities. Now that process will require a bit of time, resource and energy, and possibly a bit more money from both the Funding Board, Council and the amenities. We haven't been able to quantify that yet, but I think we'll come back to you with a report in the future around that. And then we'd look for each amenity to develop a medium-term plan. We're suggesting sort of a 3 to 5 year term. And these plans would cover off things like the level of reserves they need to maintain, to keep themselves viable, what sort of surpluses they would be looking to generate in order to fund future projects, whether they be capital or operational, what levels of service each of the amenities is planning in the immediate future, how are they intending to deal with the growth in population in Auckland, and are they looking to increase their levels of service, not just to cater with growth, but actually improve their levels of service. And we see all those being discussions which more actively involve the council group, as well as the Funding Board in each of the amenities. Once those plans have been developed by the amenities, we'd see those plans being then used to inform the annual funding process. So when annual funding decisions are being made, there's a bit more of a medium-term sort of context in which to make those. And Auckland Council has the ability within the current Act to add a funding principle which could require the funding board to take into account the medium-term plans of the amenities when making its annual funding decisions and allocations. So that basically summarises our proposed way forward. I think just a couple of observations coming out of the review that some of you who were here in the first term may recall that a couple of additional funding principles were added at that time, requiring the funding board to have regard to council's proposed rates increases and also asking the amenities to align their activities as much as possible to the Auckland plan. We see this, the outcome of this review as sort of being a continuation of the thinking that was sort of around at that time. And I think it reflects a maturing of the regime. The Act isn't that old, I guess. It's about 8 years old. I think it's fair to say that when the Act first came into being, a number of the amenities were, if not on death's door, certainly needed a fairly rapid cash injection to keep them sustainable. I think all of the amenities have developed to a point where they can now start planning with more certainty for the future. So in some ways our recommendations are just a reflection of the evolution of both the amenities and the current funding model. I think it's also worth noting that there are other sort of drivers within the sectors which these amenities operate within, and while we're not proposing significant changes to the legislation at this time, drivers for future change may in fact come from the different sectors where they currently operate, and that's perhaps something we just need to keep an eye on into the future. And perhaps as a final point, that legislative change would be a significant effort in time and resource, and would need to demonstrate a very clear benefit in going down that route. And I think our way forward, I think there's some significant improvements we can make within the current legislative framework, so I don't think at this stage would be in any way supporting legislative change, because I think there's significant improvements to be had within what we already have. So I think that would end my introduction. Happy to take any questions. I would also note that we have David Holdsworth, who's been one of the representatives from the amenities that we've been working with. He can answer questions, and we also have some members of the funding board in the audience if any questions need to be asked of them.
Well, thank you very much, Alistair. I know you've done an extremely good amount of work on this, and David, to your team, and I know there's been a working party of the amenities working on this as well, and Wayne, so I know that it probably was a piece of work that you didn't actually need on your plate at the time you got it, but you've done a really good job, so thank you very much for that. Councillor Casey.
Well, Alistair, have you heard from the 5 other boards? There's only 16 gave their views in the report. There's 2 of them are, one's Albert Eden, the other's Puketapa.
As of today, we have not, no, but we've had a report on each of their agendas. Some of the local boards felt that they were unable to give comment, so I think they simply felt they did not know enough about it to make an informed decision or informed comment. Maybe I'll hand over to Wayne.
So just after the authoring of the report, we received 2 resolutions or advice of action from 2 local boards. There was just those 2 that were there. I think one was Puketapa and the other was Papakura.
Did either of them express a preference for options?
Across the local boards, perhaps not surprisingly, we had a variety of views. There was no strong consensus amongst...
No, I understand that, but did either of those 2 boards have a preference for an option?
Puketapa referred to various components that had been addressed through the options, expressing a preference. It was in favour of continuation of the funding board, appointment of independent members to the funding board, that operational funding be determined by the funding board on a rolling basis, which would require change of legislation. consideration of capital as a particular feature of what they were recommending, as well as clarification of the term sustainable. They were also in favour of public notification of funding allocations and a greater emphasis on the fairness of the way the system works.
And the other one?
Papakura dismissed options 5, 6 and 7, also dismissed option 4 and indicated that options 2 and 3 should be more closely considered.
My second question relates to option 7 and my failure to understand why we wouldn't save money. You say in the report, this, depending on what administration is set up in the future, it would seem obvious to me that if the funding board is no longer there, then there's a huge saving.
I think what we felt was you've got to look at the administrative efficiency as well, that yes, the funding board would not be there, but council staff would have to undertake the work that they do, and the work that they do is actually quite significant. I probably shouldn't say this within the room, but I think we actually get quite a good bang for our buck out of the funding board. But by far and away the biggest cost of the funding regime is the grants is provided to the actual amenities rather than the administration costs. And I guess what we're saying is that if your goal is to provide financial sustainability to the amenities, now that would be largely neutral across the options. How much they require to keep them financially sustainable is in many ways it is what it is, and how we fund that is not irrelevant. But you've got to consider that if council's policy setting is to maintain them financially, then we're not going to make a great deal of saving by us administering and deciding how much they require to do that, as opposed to an independent funding board making that assessment. It's the amount that we pay to each of the amenities could well end up the same, depending on what council's policy framework is for that. And from an administrative point of view, the cost incurred in administering it could well be about the same as having the funding board. There's a lot of assumptions in that, because we don't know what council's policy framework would be for funding the amenities. We may decide that no, we'd look to reduce how much we provide them. All on what basis are we going to do that? Where does that leave the amenities? Would they no longer be financially sustainable? What would be the impact of that? So, but on the assumption that we'd look to keep them at the same level of financial viability, then we do not think there would be a great deal of savings in going to option 7.
Thank you. Councillor Crum.
Understand that the Act requires the funding board to provide adequate funding to the amenities, amongst other things, and acknowledging the constraints that the annual application process represents. Under the preferred option, there's a call for coming up with medium-term plans for the amenities. That's not something that we could have visibility over already and extrapolate. Why is that? That seems to be quite a big underpinning of the preferred option.
Yeah, the Act at the moment, there is an option within it for the amenities to prepare, I think, a 10-year plan, which can go to the funding board, but it's in no way compulsory. And I guess what we're saying is that the Act does require the funding board to provide the amenities with adequate funding, but it does rather beg the question, adequate for what? And to deliver what level of service, what are we actually expecting these to do? And the basis of our recommendation is that in the development of these medium-term plans, we get greater visibility of what it is actually the amenities are wanting to achieve, and are able to engage in a more informed dialogue about, well, what Auckland Council actually sees as being an appropriate level of ratepayer contribution to those services.